titled Exploring the Impact of Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging and Equity on Global Companies. And we're going to particularly look at the impact that that has on our global communications. My name's Olivia Brook. I'm the Marketing and Sales Director here at DIBE Global. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by three phenomenal leaders who I'm delighted to welcome to the virtual stage here. We're joined today by Steve Walker, founder and principal of Two Sides Transformational Consultancy. We're also joined by Pete Markey, Chief Marketing Officer at Boots, and by Serhat Ekinci, Managing Director at OMG Unite. So before we get to your proper introductions, I'm going to give a very quick overview. In this panel, we're going to be discussing how companies can be seen to be diverse, inclusive, and equitable when there are, let's face it, such varying levels of D&I understanding within countries around the world. How you guys are doing things differently to drive change across markets, but we're also going to be looking at, how we find that balance really between our global brands and what our markets actually need and what our audiences are looking for. So before we get into that detail, I'd love to hear a bit more about each of you, what your journey's been so far in how you've arrived in the positions that you're in, but also specifically why you're so passionate about diversity, inclusion and belonging. If I can start with you, Pete, please.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, Olivia. Great to be with you all this evening. I am lucky enough to run marketing for Boots in the UK and Ireland. We're a well-known UK retailer, 170 years old. And alongside what I do in my day job in marketing, I'm also the exec sponsor for what we call Marketing for Change within Boots and Walgreens Boots Alliance, which is around how we show up within all of our marketing communications and make sure we reflect the people and communities we serve day in and day out in the UK and in our other markets. And I'm also the exec sponsor for the Pride BRG Business Resource Group within Boots as well. And to answer your question, I think it's so important that within the businesses that we're in, that we create a fantastic inclusive culture where everyone can be celebrated and recognised really for who they are. Every time I've seen that happen, I've seen teams thrive and businesses succeed. It's just the right thing to do. I think it's the right thing for us as leaders to do everything we can to encourage that culture. And on the other side of that, I think from a customer perspective, particularly given the business we serve customers right up and down the UK, all sorts of different communities, people with different lived experiences. And I want to make sure in everything we do, we really reflect that. One of the things we've got, not just exclusive to the UK, but me knowing the UK the best is the market I work in. We have a rich tapestry of amazing cultures and amazing people in the UK. And I want to make sure everything we do really reflects that. So I think it's something you just can't walk past. This is a vital part of every part of our day job now to create the right culture and really reflect the communities we serve.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with that more. I'm going to jump now to Steve, if I may.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia, and hi, everybody. I've enjoyed the career from a number of different facets for a number of years as a global leader in large global businesses, among them Sony and Ericsson as CMO, but then more recently running my own business, helping companies to make transformation in their leadership, in their culture, in their brands. And that's seen me working with a number of different global companies, among them GN Group, where I've been acting CMO, but also sitting on their diversity and inclusion executive committee as well, and really helping them to champion more inclusive leadership and a more inclusive way of running their business and engaging with their customers as well. So like Pete mentioned, there's many good reasons to believe in this, and I'm sure all of us would say that we're champions for diversity and inclusion, and it's really important for people to give it a very serious amount of energy. From my own personal perspective, I see that coming through all aspects of my work. In other parts of my professional life, I sit on the board of a charity that's trying to provide inclusive access to energy for people in some of the most disadvantaged communities of the world. And I also run a youth football club, which is really trying to promote more girls playing football. And I think what you find once you start to champion these issues, it crops up in every aspect of your working life, and indeed in every aspect of your personal life as well. And just happy to be here and talking about these topics today. So thank you.
Excellent. That's a super introduction. Serhat, last but by no means least, let's hear something from you.
Hi, Liv. So for me, it's a bit of a personal one as well. That I am mixed. I wasn't born and raised here, and then my wife is mixed from a different continent. And having worked in various agencies across various big brands as well, one of the things that really struck me was a lot of the D&I conversation was on the internal people and culture side. Whereas the outputs, the marketing outputs, I felt that was not necessarily representative of myself or my wife and my family, or even if it was done in a very stereotypically traditional way. Hence, in 2016, I moved to IMG to set up a specialist division called Unite. So we created it. We focus on sort of moving clients from unconscious exclusion to conscious inclusion by diversifying their marketing activities to be inclusive of their consumers. And I've been here for about 7 years, and it's been an amazing journey. So we do a lot of things around content, media, and insight. And on the side of that, I also sit on the D&I steering group and also sponsor the multicultural network that we have internally. So working with the chairs and the committee. And outside of work, also I'm part of a few groups, one of which is MIFA, Media for All, a large network of people of color from different aspects of media and creative industries, where we do mentoring and various networking events.
Wow. Well, I think what I'm hearing from all of you, and I think it's reflected on a number of the panels from earlier in the day, you know, if you're passionate about diversity and inclusion, it runs through every part of your life, right? This isn't just something that's a day job or it's part of your main role. In many cases, it actually isn't part of your main role, and it's something that you've built in, and it very much is either side of desk or it's personal life or whatever that might be. And it's fantastic that we are making change, but there's clearly a lot more to do, and that everybody's so passionate about it. Right, so I'm gonna get moving on the main part of this panel, and if I may, I'd like to go first to Pete. Could you talk me through what are your biggest challenges when you're embedding diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity in the various markets and audiences that you work with?
I think it's a challenge and an opportunity, Olivia, in equal measure. I think the hardest part is getting started, isn't it? I think, and also I see some companies almost quite fearful of getting it wrong. So that bit of like, we might get it wrong. And I think it's, there will be mistakes you'll make, almost unconscious things along the way. That's okay. But doing nothing is not an option. So the starting point, I think, is to see where you are, see what has already been achieved, the work done to date, and then set a very clear expectation, ambition of what you want to do. But critically, it's involving the right people. We found establishing, I don't know, other companies have done similar things with inclusion networks. We found the business resource groups have been invaluable to act as a voice back within the business we're in. So you get going, you start to do activities, but you involve the business resource groups, you get their thoughts, their input. Because for me, why the BRGs are really important is in any business, you've got a sense of where you want to go to. Actually, it's helpful to check in with members of certain communities and go, look, is this right? We do it a lot on our marketing. For Pride Month, for example, you really want to make sure the Pride BRG are completely involved in shaping the plans and working with you. It's brilliant. That's what partnership looks like, and also avoids any of those inadvertent mistakes you might make along the way. So I think you start with where you're at. Doing nothing's not an option. You build a very clear plan, you establish business resource groups, and you surround yourself with really great people who've got the skill and expertise, either from within the specific community or work with great agency partners who can work with you and challenge you. If I look at the on the LGBT side, for example, we partner and work very closely with Stonewall. It's brilliant to have someone external to act as to challenge you, to prompt you as well, and to set the bar for where you want to get to. So I think that the challenges are in that sort of initial fearful get going, we could get it wrong. working out who to partner with and finding the right people to bring on the journey with you. But I think, like all these things, once you've got momentum and got going, these things move really quickly. I look back to my last job at TSB, which is a UK bank, part of Sabadell, a Spanish bank, and I started there as the exec sponsor of LGBT, and it had literally a handful of few people. Once I was able to get the right people around us, build activities out, create content, get momentum going, have an activity plan, we had such a powerful impact within the business that grew and grew and grew, and then spread across the other networks, and then spread more into what we're doing as a business. So, the right people, and you've talked about this, Olivia, the right people with the right passion and the right motivation can make an enormous difference. The bit that particularly excites me around this whole topic is the exec teams in any business has a really important role to play. Not going to dodge that. It's really important. But equally, there's a groundswell of great work coming up through the organization. So it's not a top-down, it's best to top-down, bottom-up. The two things come together, then it's amazing and powerful. I love that when our BRG groups are with us as an exec team talking through what they're doing. That's brilliant. That connection point is so powerful. So yeah, hardest bit is getting going. Doing nothing is not an option.
Fantastic. That's absolutely superb. There's some great points there. Can I jump to Serhat for you to chip in on this?
Yes, absolutely. I think the bit that we always, when we talk to clients, most of them get scared to do something. But I think that was the key that for me, that doing nothing is not gonna cut it. Even if you, even if you put the moral side to one corner, if you think about the size of diverse audiences in the UK, or even if you take multicultural as an example, right, where if you look at census results over the last 2 decades, 80% of the growth came from ethnic minorities, and collectively they represent about 20% of the population, and that's based on a census that's 10 years old. The new results will come out soon. So the size of them is almost, you can't dismiss it. And I think the challenge comes when you talk to clients is that they're scared to make mistakes, and you will make mistakes, but it's not just about diversity either. Across everything you do, there's always not every campaign that you run is perfect. There's always the problems or challenges, but you learn by making mistakes. But one thing I always recommend to clients is you need to define or distill what inclusivity means for you. And the way we do it normally is looking at the brand and or the product, whatever you're doing it, and defining which facets of diversity fits within that. And if there are certain relevancy or differences, be it the way they use your products, or through your marketing activities, whether you're reaching those audiences, or if you're reaching them, is it at the same frequency? And in some cases, it could be a sort of tweaking your brand campaigns to make sure that you reach them, and you reach them at the same, it could be using diverse content and programming in your outreach, using diverse media outlets, which again drives equality, but also it makes business sense from a campaign perspective. And in some cases, you might realize that as a brand, you're not really connecting with certain communities, be it Black African communities or certain groups within LGBTQ groups, that you might need to do more bespoke campaigns to try to engage and win them. And the key that I feel that a lot of brands or a lot of our clients need to understand, and brands need to understand, is such a massive spectrum, right? Diversity. Even if you think of certain groups, like take multicultural as an example. I mean, we tend to put them into one group, such as Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, but there's so many differences, intersectionalities. And if you try to think of your marketing process, like how you get from a brief into a campaign, you've got so many different teams involved, and so many, and all these teams are not going to be representative. It's just impossible. You might have an overall company representation, but at an individual team level, you will struggle because it's so diverse. Hence, it's very important, whether it's the BRGs, that you get involved, or external partners or specialists. And that's one of the reasons that we exist, to make sure that conscious inclusion is sort of embedded into everything you do. So we work almost side by side with the brands to make sure that the mistakes are minimized. And I think that's what I would say, whether it's the BRGs or get those people from communities to be at the heart of it, leading the decision, versus just being there to check stuff for you, if you know what I mean.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, there's such a valuable resource. It makes absolute sense, to dissipate that fear of making mistakes by using the resources at our fingertips, right, which are often in our own organizations. Steve, in terms of the challenges on embedding across different markets, anything you'd like to add on those points?
Yeah, I think both Pete and Serhat made excellent points, and I would agree, particularly the point Pete made about a bottom-up and a top-down initiative. That's exactly what we've experienced in GN. You 100% need your executive leadership team to be behind the need to take action. Otherwise, nothing really happens. But at the same time, you can't force action downwards in an organization. It has to grow bottom-up. It has to be a grassroots movement. In GM, we call them ERGs, employee resource groups, rather than business resource groups, but it's the same point. One thing that's occurred to me a lot recently is we talk about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, but it's often diversity and inclusion that get mentioned. Now, you can have a diverse workforce, but it doesn't mean that people feel belonging, and it doesn't mean they feel equity. So one of the things we discovered from the ERGs in GN is there has been quite a lot of work done, particularly in certain markets like the US, to have a much more diverse workforce. But when you speak to those ERGs and ask them, do they feel a sense of belonging to the organization, often they still feel very disadvantaged. And I think it's important that we think about all facets of this, not just achieving a more diverse workforce or a more diverse campaign. Is it actually having the outcome of greater sense of inclusivity and belonging for your employees or for your customers?
Yeah, very, very good point, actually. Certainly food for thought. And I think when we're measuring, I don't know whether we're actually measuring on campaigns in those specific audiences. Yes, we can measure whether we've reached them. Are we measuring that sense of, do you feel that this is a brand for you in a specific audience? I mean, obviously, the way that we're measuring and what we're measuring is moving on. But yeah, that's certainly given me a lot of food for thought. If I can move on to the second question, and I'm going to come to you first, Steve, with this. Where we've got markets that are not, let's say, not accepting of certain facets, right? Of certain facets of visible and invisible diversity. How do you manage the balance between, particularly with a global brand, how do you manage the balance between what your global brand wants to be seen as and everything that goes on within the campaigns and what that stands for, versus local culture and sensitivities that you might find in those cultures? If I can start with you, please, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the age-old problem for anyone who runs any kind of global marketing network of, do we do everything the same, or do we recognize differences and allow those to propagate within the way that we communicate and in the way that we act? And I think it's exactly the same when we talk about issues of diversity and inclusion. It's just perhaps they're even more exacerbated because of the sensitivity of the topic and the personal nature of it. But to me, at least, the way I always try to address those kinds of issues with all the marketing organizations I've run is, first we need to understand, are people not accepting of the solution, or are they not accepting of the problem? If they're not accepting of the solution, we can always discuss different solutions. But if they're not accepting of the problem in the first place, it's a harder nut to crack. And so I think the first step is always to really collaborate with organizations, both centrally and locally, is to what problem we're trying to solve, what is really the thing that we're trying to achieve. And then we can always debate what is the best solution to overcome that problem. But we've got to get alignment around the core strategy that we're trying to achieve first. And to me, I've always considered that consistency, we often get very hung up on consistency of application. Does everything look the same, or does it look like we want it to look like? To me, that's actually not so important. What's more important is, are we consistently deploying our strategy And are we consistently living up to our principles? If strategy and principles are set and clear and consistently deployed, you can then actually apply those principles in any number of different ways, with cultural relevance or with relevance to a particular community that you're trying to reach. So I think sometimes we get a bit hung up on the wrong thing. It's not so much if everything looks the same or feels like it comes from the same place, but are we true to the story we're trying to tell? Are we true to the strategy we're trying to deploy? And are we true to the principles of how we said we will conduct ourselves and conduct our business?
I could not agree more. I mean, yeah, it is very difficult when, particularly, you know, your brand identity, your campaign identity, and then running things across different markets. But yeah, it's an interesting approach is looking at, yeah, the consistency in not necessarily the look and feel, but actually what's the message, what's the story, and is that true?
Exactly. Are we telling the right story? Exactly. However we tell it, are we telling the right story?
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Pete, let me come to you on that, please.
Yeah, no problem. Steve, I love what you're saying. I think big fan of brand purpose. And I think if your business really knows its purpose and what it's about, it's living and breathing it, you need to do that through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging in what you do. And that also means potentially showing up in some markets differently to reflect the important nuance of culture. I also think it's a relevance bit of some things just don't translate. Some ideas don't translate very well. So actually having something that fits for a market and is more culturally relevant is really important. I was CMO for a global insurance company, and you know, it was fascinating which ideas just wouldn't carry between markets. So you have to be, this is about really listening to your customer and your audience and tailoring your brand towards it. I think also at the heart of your question, Olivia, is if you're in a market where you as a business stand for advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, yet the culture or the environment of the country or environment you're in is not in the same space. I guess I come back to my earlier point around, but doing nothing is therefore not an option either. So I'm going to build on what Steve was saying, which is, I think if that's what your brand's about and your storytelling is about, is you know, how do you yourselves help to advance the, you know, what you want to see, you know, the positivity that your brand brings in the way it does, but also stays true to the cultural sensitivity you're in. It's a bit of a fine line, but I think again, there are things I've seen brands do where they can steadily start to progress an agenda in a good way that's true and authentic to them, but reflects the culture of what they believe is right to see as a brand and shows the influence of what they can do. And if I look at, you know, even in the UK and where the UK has come from and to in the last sort of 20, 30, it's quite incredible when you look back over the last 20 or 30 years. And a lot of that's come from really important moments where people have either created content or advocated for things or stood for things. So it's back to the bit around, you know, brands can't tread water either. So it is a fight. I'm not going to make it sound, oh, it's all easy. It's not. It's hard. But I think coming back to Steve's wording, if your brand is authentic, has a true story at its core, and stands for something, then your brand can also be a positive agent of change in the right way. I think it can be a powerful mechanism for change.
And as you reiterated, doing nothing is not an option. So it's accepting that there are sensitivities and listening to what you're hearing, you know, and again, I would imagine your ERGs can help there in terms of a test bed, you know, in testing out, we have this story, this is how we want to tell it. You know, as you say, doing nothing's not an option, but we do accept that we're going to need to tell this story, which is our authentic, true story and purpose, but in a way that's well received and will land well in that particular audience group.
Everybody said it as well. You're going to make mistakes. It's impossible to get it 100% right, and there's no magic answer here. So I think back to Pete's point, and Serhat said it as well. Better to try and trip over once or twice rather than not do anything.
Yeah. It's a really important point. Is where I've seen work go wrong is when a creative bit of work particularly tries to represent a certain community. For example, the LGBT plus community, and it just doesn't reflect the real lived experience. So someone who isn't in that community has written a storyline, and you go, but that's not the lived experience. So it's back to what you were saying, both Steve and Olivia, about involving groups like the ERG or BRG is how do you make sure you're reflecting a true lived experience? Don't pretend that you have walked in someone else's shoes when you haven't. that authenticity, that lack of authenticity shines through in the work. The greatest work reflects the authenticity of you understand that lived experience through someone else's eyes, and great work opens the world up to see that lived experience. And that's where great agencies, great creatives, great BRGs, ERGs are so powerful because a lot of this is about storytelling, isn't it? Great advertising is great storytelling. We love amazing, authentic stories. So make them authentic and get them right. Work with people who can make those stories amazing and really connect. And all the mechanisms we talked about really help with that.
Brilliant.
I'd say great leadership is great storytelling as well.
Yeah,
so both
brilliant.
inside the company, you can also tell a good story. So.
Yeah. And interestingly, something that cropped up on a panel earlier today was talking about, authenticity. We were actually talking about leadership, and authenticity is something that certainly customers, when you're advertising, will sniff out a mile off. If it's not authentic, it will actually be more damaging than anything.
It is also as well, Olivia, the bit around. We've seen it particularly in Pride, haven't we? Where there's the rainbow washing of a brand might do reflect the LGBT plus community in content, but then it's not in the lived experience of the organisation. It comes back, I think, to everything we said of everything. It just has to be authentic. So if you're going to communicate something, you should be living and breathing it in your business and living and breathing it to your customers. And so I think that's part of the difficult bit of businesses, as Steve's saying, you're worried about getting it wrong, is get all those bits right. When I was at TSB, we didn't actively talk externally around what we were doing on inclusion till a year into our program, because we're going to get it to a point where we were in a really good place for our team members and within the business before we go out and talk externally about what we're doing. So I think that's smart. Get your house in order, sort things, really respect, create the right culture for your team members, create those ERGs, BRGs, then go out and do things. But otherwise you will particularly, get called out for it. Authenticity is so vital here. Yeah.
And Serhat, I'd imagine you've seen quite a bit of this with the various brands that you've worked with over the years, and how you're advising on whether it's media channel or whether it's content itself. So love to hear your views on this.
No, 100%. I think both Pete's and Steve's points were so relevant, and I think it's the general thing, right? Do we go global or local? It's a mixture, but I think what's really important, and when we talk to clients, and one thing that a lot of them make mistakes on is defining why you're doing this. Is it more, we want to make the lives of marginalized communities better. It's almost like creating a global overarching role of and purpose of why you're doing this. Then that can sort of trickle down into more localized versions. So be it, as an example, it could be your purpose is around making the lives of marginalized communities better. Or in some cases, from a marketing perspective, it could be about growth. I know it's more on the commercial side, as in we want to grow our audiences. We haven't been speaking to these audiences, or we haven't been speaking to them in the right environment with the right content, or it could be the product usage is different by community. So it's defining why you're doing this, I think, is really key. So whenever we talk to clients, the first question I ask, why you're doing this? Is it more growth? Is it more, you want to more do goods? Is moral aspect of it? And I think then that almost like creates your overarching brand purpose. And that can be applied to various communities across the world. And that becomes a bit like what Pete said, top to bottom. So you get local markets where, in some markets, it will be more of a, let's say, women issue from a gender perspective. And in some markets, they want to back more, let's say, LGBTQ sexuality aspect of things. And in some markets, it could be an ethnicity-driven thing, or in some markets, it's religion. So I think then that's where they tackle it. And you do need to get local knowledge into this. One of the things I think is quite common with the general sort of global, let's say, creative space, right? It's very common that you get a global creatives and the local markets will, or we will this is not relevant, this is not going to resonate with our audiences. And it happens a lot when it comes to sort of inclusive marketing approach, where I think one good example I remember, I won't mention the name of the brand, but a makeup brand as an example, where they've taken something from UAE for Ramadan that they use for sahur, which is the time where Muslims break fast. But in countries like Dubai, they said that the life changes during Ramadan. People start going out in the evening, early in the morning, sort of 2 a.m. And that's where they eat before they start fasting. So they use the same creative in the UK. But in the UK, Muslims will be sitting in their pajamas at 2 a.m. when they eat to start their fasting. So it's the same audience, but their behavior is very different, right? And I think that's the key, where don't make an assumption that, whether it's that's South Asians or certain groups, different diverse audiences, they behave the same. And I think that's very key, where you need to make sure that you talk to local markets before you do something. And that's where the local knowledge plus diverse communities, be it internally or externally, comes into life. But what we usually recommend, once you have an overarching sort of goal, then define your audiences. And that's what it sounds quite fancy, but, look at things with cultural lenses, sort of conscious inclusion. By that we mean, when you're looking at your audiences and everything you do, not just, don't just look at it by general demographics like their age, gender, but look at it by ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and then understand whether your product or brand, the relevancy to certain communities, and that almost helps you define what you need to do. And if you need to do more work towards certain audiences, whether you need to create different products for certain audiences. And in some cases, and this is a common mistake that brands make, as an example, where let's say we work with one of an alcohol brand as an example, and they were trying to target, I think 24 to 34 audiences. And in the UK, they were using Pakistani and Bangladeshi channels, because by age they do fit into that audience groups, and that's how we buy media, based on age usually. But they don't realize that majority of Pakistani and Bangladeshis won't drink, because and that could be a sort of scandal as well if it came across. And I think that's what we mean by, you need to sort of consciously look at everything with cultural lenses, be it how you define your audiences, what media types you use, and channels, making sure that your plans do reach them. And even if you reach them, is your creative accessible? And that doesn't mean, you need to show an LGBTQ person to an LGBTQ person. It will differ from product to product and relevancy, but make sure that what you're showing them will resonate with these audiences. And in some cases, you might need to create bespoke creators, but again, it will depend on the brief that you're working on. And it sort of leaves through. So it's almost like, you work with influencers, but do you have a diverse set of influencers based on your key audiences? It's almost like defining what inclusivity means for you is key. And one of the things that we do, the reason we call our approach sort of unconscious exclusion to conscious inclusion, is the bias that exists. That a lot of, if you do the things that you normally do, doesn't become inclusive in terms of marketing outputs. So as an example, when you think about research, what nationally representative means is the sample sizes is by age, gender, and location. So what that means is you might have done, let's say, a product research based on a sample that may not have anyone from a different ethnic minority background or LGBTQ background or disabled backgrounds. And the same thing happens, let's say, media measurement platforms. We have that issue in the UK, but in Germany, as an example, it's even worse, where their TV measurement system, where it gives you the ratings of which channels people watch, they actually have no Turkish channels as part of that mix. And Turkish people are the biggest ethnic minority there, and they do consume a lot of Turkish TV. but that's mainly driven by the fact that because the households that they use are not Turkish. But these things, so then you put a plan together that tells you you're reaching 99% of the TV viewers when in reality you don't. So it's like, look at things with conscious inclusion perspective, and that really, really changes. It takes time, but by time, if you keep constantly doing it, it just becomes the new normal, if that makes sense. You know, a bit like we talk about unconscious bias training, right? It's brilliant to have it, but if you don't apply it on a day-to-day basis, it becomes just one training that you've done and you put it to the side. But yeah, that's pretty much what I would say. There's obviously different aspects to it as well. But looking at things with relevancy to local market and with the people being at the heart of it from those communities.
Brilliant, that's excellent. And you've kind of already touched on this a little bit in the answer that you've given, Serhat, but you know, we were talking about making things relevant and how you do find that balance, but you gave us some really good examples in your response. How do you have you had any learnings where you can actually translate things across markets? So some things worked here and we can actually translate that into other markets as well?
Yeah, certain things. I mean, I think as an example, cultural events are quite like there's certain things that will be relevant. Let's say the makeup brand was a good example, but if you were to, if I take an example, the way that you break iftar during Ramadan is pretty much across the world similar in that it's all about gathering with family and friends to do it together. So it's a time of connectivity and forgiveness. So it's finding what we call commonality. And I think that's where sometimes brands also get scared, because once you start digging deeper into the audiences, you realize that there are too many differences and it becomes too difficult to implement. I give London as an example. Like if you know, we talk about inclusivity for all, but in London alone, technically there's 300 plus languages spoken. And as a marketeer, if I go to the marketing team and say, you need to create 300 different creatives with 300 different representation of people in different languages, it becomes a nightmare to execute. So it's finding the commonality that you can use to connect with those communities. And I think that's what I would say many brands struggle, because when you read stuff externally, it's all about being inclusive of all, which is right thing to do. But what it means from a marketing outputs is very different.
Okay. Yeah, commonality across. I mean, because you're right. 300 types of creative is not going to wash with any client that I would imagine you've ever worked with. Pete, can I just come to you with that? Any particular learnings that you've had that you can translate across, whether it's different audience groups, different markets that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think back to some of the earlier points you raised. You know, you've got the same brand wherever. I mean, I worked in Aviva in the UK. Aviva, big global insurance company. Actually, the brand was the brand, but again, the articulation of how you showed up was really important. There were cultural nuances. Also, even just things like sometimes the products you sell or how they're sold. I'm not going to bore anyone, although I find insurance fascinating, but insurance is sold so differently in different markets and can be quite a different product. I was on the board of a Russian insurance company for a while, and it's so different in Russia to here. And actually, there was a Russian insurance company that tried to copy what Direct Line did, sort of cutting out a middleman and the broker, and actually got in real trouble because the implication was they were putting brokers out of business, and people really liked brokers in Russia. They liked that they were friends with them. They'd have them around for dinner. And again, a cultural bit of, trying to take something from one country and going, oh, everyone wants to save money by cutting the middleman. You take it to someone like Russia, like, no, actually, I quite like the middleman. He comes around to dinner, she comes around to dinner, and I have a great relationship with them and they look after me. So it's quite different, those nuances. So again, that's a bit about getting the culture and the environment right. But I think my biggest learning is around keeping that brand consistency, that you could put everything up on, theoretically, on a wall or digital wall and go, right, this is still the same business. Yeah, throughout, it's still the same core thread of what we're about, what we stand for, but we're choosing to show that up in and evidence that in different ways in different markets, also based on, as Serhat said, the bits that really resonate in those different markets. It might be actually that bit of the brand is really important here. It's like, isn't it? We've all got different facets to our personalities, and when we show up, we'll show different bits to different people. And actually, it's the same with the brand. I want to dial up that bit in this market, that bit and that bit. I want to down that bit, increase that bit. So it's all about knowing yourself, knowing your brand, and tailoring it to that market.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And because I know that we're coming towards the end of this fantastic panel, can I please jump to you, Steve, on that same point about cross markets?
I think both Pete and Serhat have talked very eloquently on the subject. Not much to add from my side, but just to come back to something we've said already, that this is where your ERGs or BRGs can really help you, because they can create a sort of representative sample of the communities that you're trying to reach. And what we've seen in GN, at least, is things that we've started in one market have cross-pollinated, not because anybody sitting in the center of the company has dictated they should do so, but again, it's creating a movement within the organization has been very, very powerful, and let things grow to some extent themselves. Now, for any global CMO, that's always a little bit nerve-wracking when you let things sort of grow like that across, rather than everything coming through the center. But ultimately, I think that is the way to create a more inclusive spirit in the company. Is you do allow creativity to occur anywhere within your network, and then of course you manage that, and you ensure that it's nurtured in the right way. But if you say that all creativity has to happen in one place, then it tends to go wrong. So allow creativity to blossom everywhere, and particularly to bring people within your own company who are representing the people you're trying to reach.
That's just what a lovely note to help to guide us into our wrap comments. I mean, I've found this fascinating. I thought I'm going to have a few key things I'm going to want to talk about. It's really hard to pick. I mean, there's so many key points there, but what I'm loving is doing nothing is not an option. There is a fear of making mistakes, and you should really try to get your house in order. And ERGs can be such a tremendous test bed resource there. People's lived experiences help to drive our authenticity, which feeds back into that kind of consistency. Doesn't have to come in look and feel. It can come in terms of the story we're telling, what we stand for as a business, the story we're telling, and how we're telling it. So essentially, you were saying strategy, principles, and what you stand for being very positive. We do have to turn up in some markets differently. That's inevitable. But yeah, that consistency and commonality across cultures is a really great starting point. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to thank my wonderful panelists here today. I'm sure everybody on the chat has learned a lot. I certainly have. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We're now going to close day one of our September 22 summit. So do leave any questions that you have in the chat box, and one of the team at DIBE Global will be in touch. If you are commenting on social, please don't forget to tag DIBE Global, and we'd love it if you use our hashtag Moving the Dial. We'd love it if you're joining us day 2 tomorrow. It is actually face-to-face, and there will be footage of it on the hub, on the DIBE Global community after the event. I'm now going to hand over to our wonderful CEO and the founder of DIBE Global, Layla Mackenzie Dulles. Thank you, everybody, for joining.